So before we answer the question, what difference did the Reformation make, we need to remember why we're thinking about the Reformation right now. And many of you probably know it was 500 years ago, on the 31st of October, that Martin Luther supposedly nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And I say supposedly because historians aren't really sure, and I'll explain to you why. That is the Castle Church of Wittenberg, and right here is the door, where if he did nail them, that's where he put them. The reason they're doubting that is that Luther, in his voluminous writings, over 100 volumes, you can't even get your hands around them. Right? I can't reach as far as Luther wrote. Right? In none of his writings did he ever say that he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. The first time that that ever was recorded was by a friend of his, Philip Melanchthon. Keep that name in mind because I'm going to talk about him a little later. Philip Melanchthon said 30 years after the event, after Luther was dead, that he, Luther, had put the Theses on the Castle Church door. And historians are a little skeptical because it took that long for anybody to remember that he did that. So we're not really sure if he did or not, but one thing for sure is that there was a Reformation. That's not in doubt. When it began, we're not sure. And that is the Castle Church door. And when I saw that for the first time in 1990, the first thing that struck me was that door is made of bronze. How do you put a nail in a door made of bronze? Well, later I found out that the original door of the Castle Church was destroyed in 1760 in a war that was called the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War. This church and the door and everything was completely destroyed. And what you see here in this area is all a reconstruction, a commemorative door of bronze that was erected in 1858. So it took almost 100 years to get the door replaced in this way. And if you walk up closely, you can see the 95 Theses embossed on the door. If you can read Latin, because they were written and published in Latin for the university community to dispute. If you could read Latin, you could read all 95 Theses right there on the door. It would take you a little while, though, because it covers the whole door. Well, so much for that. And there's a little connection between that door being destroyed and the city of Pittsburgh. And you won't believe what it is. I don't know if any of you are history buffs, but do you know what the 7 Years' War was called here in America? The French and Indian War, absolutely. There's a gentleman that knows his history. And the French and Indian War was the war that turned Fort Duquesne into Fort Pitt and the beginning of Pittsburgh. So the genesis of Pittsburgh here in the French and Indian War was at the same time that the original door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg was destroyed. The same war destroyed that door as was fought here in Pittsburgh. Well, I want to talk just a little bit about some changes that the Reformation has made inside the church, but talk mostly about changes that have taken place outside the church, because those are the ones that people don't always understand or fully appreciate. 3 churches right here in the city of Pittsburgh. I wonder if you recognize any of them. How about let's start with the big one on the left here. Anybody know what that? That's St. Paul's Cathedral in Oakland, the seat of the Bishop of Pittsburgh in the Roman Catholic Church. And this one, if you can read carefully, says Church of the Ascension. Anybody know where that is? No, it's about a block away from that church. If you walk up 5th Avenue, 1 block, to Neville Street, you will see the Church of the Ascension. And then I think Wally here probably knows what that building is, right?
Trinity Lutheran.
That's First Trinity Lutheran, which is about a block up Neville Street from the Church of the Ascension. So we have within a 2-block span a Roman Catholic church, an Anglican church, and a Lutheran church. That's just part of what the Reformation has caused. We have lots of different denominations. It has caused a divided church. In addition to Catholics, we now have Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, a whole row of independent churches, to say nothing of the Eastern Orthodox. I wonder, is anybody here Eastern Orthodox? Nobody here, okay. Well, remember, the church was already split at the time of the Reformation because the Eastern Orthodox Church was founded about 500 years prior to the Reformation. So the church was already in 2 halves when the Reformation took place in the 1500s. Another change inside the church is that the Reformation provided a renewed church, renewed liturgy. The people began to have their worship services in the language of the people that they knew, not in Latin, which only the priest knew. New hymns. Martin Luther and others brought hymn singing into the church. Now, in the Middle Ages, prior to the Reformation, hymn singing was not unheard of, but it wasn't very popular. And Luther made hymn singing in the language of the people very popular. It brought us new catechisms. That's my third point here. New books to teach people, especially children, the fundamentals of the faith. Catechisms by Martin Luther and catechisms by many of the famed reformers, and also eventually even the Catholic Church began to write catechisms to have their faith propagated from one generation to the next. And finally, a new Bible translation. As you might know, Martin Luther spent about 14 years translating the entire Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek into German. And that translation was followed by many others in French and English and all the European languages. So new Bibles. Some of the new things in the church that the Reformation has brought. Now I want to get to my main point for this afternoon, and that's those changes outside the church. Changes in society that still are reflected today in our society, but a lot of people don't know about them. I've brought out 4 areas here: political government, work and vocation, family life, and education. I'm going to take each of those in sequence. And then if you have any questions on what I've said, I'd be very glad to answer them. That is a map of Europe at the time of the Reformation. Now, as a German teacher, I look at that map and I see one thing. I see France, a united country. I see Spain, a united country, and England, a united country. But Germany, look at this, is made up of lots of tiny pieces. It's really not even called Germany. Now, I did pretty well with that first history question. I got a correct answer. I wonder, any of you who are interested in history, when can we speak of Germany as a unified country for the first time? Not many people know this. Anybody know? And it wasn't after 1990 in the fall of communism. That wasn't it either. Anybody know? When did Germany begin? Well,
wasn't there Austria-Hungary?
There was Austria-Hungary, but that was not part of Germany.
No.
That's part of the reason that Germany was Germany and Austria-Hungary was Austria-Hungary. It was 1871, after the American Civil War. Now, you may have heard of a man named Otto von Bismarck. They named a battleship after him, right? Otto von Bismarck pulled together many of these separate independent German states. And finally, you can talk about Germany as a unified nation in 1871, after the American Civil War. So Germany, in some sense, is a young country. Well, On the left here, you see the title page of what is called the Augsburg Settlement. It was an agreement they came to in 1555, so it took a long time from the time of the posting of the theses to come to this agreement. But this agreement established that the prince of each state in that empire would determine what religion would be adopted in his territory. So, how do you know what faith you are? It depends on what your prince says he is. That's how it was determined. You probably don't like that as Americans, right? No American likes that idea. Well, they had a fancy Latin term that they used to describe that. I wonder, anybody ever studied Latin here? Oh, that's good to see. Yeah, I'm going to say it in Latin, and if you know what it means, tell me. If you don't, I'll tell you. Cuius regio eos religio. Anybody want to take a stab at that? Maybe it's been a while since you've had Latin. Oh, yeah. Well, it means whose region, his religion, right? So the person who owns the principality, the prince of the principality, would determine whether that principality was Protestant or Catholic. And as you probably know, it so happened that the northern German states and all of Scandinavia were Protestant, and the southern German states, France and Spain as well, were Catholic. So it was a north-south divide politically as a result of this Reformation. Well, one thing about Luther and how he understood civil authority, civil government, he said the prince is called by God, prince is called by God to rule and care for his people, and the people are called by God to obey their prince. Now, that works okay if the prince is doing what he's supposed to be doing. But what happens if the prince isn't doing what he's supposed to be doing? Do the people still obey? Well, that was a problem that Luther didn't really deal too much with. He just thought you should obey, period. But he did say if your prince asks you to do something that's against the law of God, if he tells you to go out and murder someone or to steal something, you don't have to do it. But unless it's against the law of God, you've got to obey your prince, because he's called by God to be the prince. Very foreign idea for us Americans. Now moving on to the second topic, work and vocation. This is one of the really big areas that people often overlook. Martin Luther made it acceptable to be something other than a priest or a nun if you were a religious person. Before Luther, if you were a religious person, you basically had to become a priest or a nun. And that meant that you were going to spend your life single, celibate, without a wife or a husband, without a family. And he says, no, all vocations are equally acceptable before God. And I've got a quotation here from one of Luther's best-known biographers. He said, as Luther has extended the priesthood of all believers, so likewise he extended the concept of divine calling or vocation to all worthy occupations. This was revolutionary. Luther said that God has called the shoemaker to be a shoemaker. He has called the butcher to be a butcher. He has called the homemaker to be a homemaker. He has called the candlestick maker to be a candlestick maker. They are called by God as much as any priest or nun is called by God to their profession. And it changed attitudes toward work and society. I've put down some medieval pictures of occupations here and captioned them. All are called by God. Up at the top, we have a blacksmith shop. Over here, a woman spinning. Here, a baker taking his bread out of the oven. Down here, we have a forge, metal workers, a woman churning butter. And finally, over here, a monk in his cell reading and writing. So they're all on the same level, according to Luther. They're all called by God. One is not above the other. Also from Luther's biographer, God has no hands and feet of his own. He must continue his labors through human instruments. So the work of a shoemaker is God working to make shoes. The work of the butcher is God working as a butcher, continuing his work of creation. Well, also in family life, there was a great impact from the Reformation. Over here, on this side of the screen, is the monastery in Erfurt, Germany, where Martin Luther studied after he was nearly killed by a bolt of lightning. Maybe you know the story. He said, "Saint Anne, help me." And he said, "I'll become a monk if you save me from this electrical storm." And he was saved, and he entered the monastery. But he didn't stay there. He didn't have a very happy time in the monastery. And I put these two pictures together, life in the monastery versus family life at home, and the arrow in between to show what basically Luther did. He left the monastery and eventually established his own home. He had children, and, well, we're going to move into that now. There they are, Martin Luther on this side. In later years, he was 42 years old when he was married, old for today and very old for his day. This is his wife, Katharina von Bora, and she was a nun. Oh, no. Now, imagine, even today, that is a very scandalous thing. If you go into your parish on Sunday morning and you found that the priest has run away with a nun, you wouldn't quite know what to do, right? Even today, it's something of a scandal. Well, this was all done after Luther was excommunicated from the church. So he begins to try to figure out how he's going to live his life apart from the Catholic Church. And this is one thing that he decides to do. He gets married, and he has 6 children. And believe it or not, that is Martin Luther's house. That is a large building, believe me, a very large building. It was the old Augustinian monastery in the town of Wittenberg, where Luther eventually went after leaving the monastery in Erfurt. So he lived in this monastery for a time as a monk. And when the Reformation came, the Prince of Saxony, who was the protector of Martin Luther, the Prince of Saxony gave that whole building to Martin Luther as a wedding present because it was no longer being used as a monastery. Right? So he lived in that house, and his students from the university lived in that house. It was something of a dormitory. And his wife, Katharina, was responsible for feeding 20, 30, 35 people every day. She had a gigantic garden. They had fruit trees, and they had to make butter and cheese and slaughter the pigs and all of the things that one normally has to do, but for a very, very large group of people. In addition, they had 6 of their own children. So it was quite an interesting house. Here is a picture from Martin Luther's famous table talk. I'll mention that a little bit later. But here you see Luther at the table, and here are some of his guests. In addition to his students, there were always people coming from all over Europe to Wittenberg to talk to Luther, to find out what he thought about certain things. And his family is standing over here at the side, and you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 kids there. The picture, there's 2 problems with the picture. One is that everything I've heard about the Luther home, those kids were always at the table with everybody else. It was one large family. So they were not standing off to the side. And Luther himself, when he saw this picture, he says, if you can read it at the bottom, there is an unpardonable omission. Kati is not there. His wife, it was not put in the picture. And he was very upset that she wasn't there because she was the heart and soul not only of the family, but also of the whole dormitory life and the life of the students and the visitors that they had from all over Europe. And again, from the biographer, the Luther who got married and actually founded a home did more than any other person to determine the tone of German domestic relations for the next 4 centuries. Into the 20th century, he says, German family life was colored by the example that Martin Luther and his wife Katharina set. Now, I personally think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not a whole lot. He had really a transformative impact on family life and the understanding of what a family ought to be. This is my own statement. Remaining celibate, remaining without a wife or a husband, one's whole life was no longer seen as particularly virtuous in those states that were Protestant. So you didn't look down at your pastor if he was married. In fact, you thought, that's the good thing for my pastor to be married. It changed that whole dynamic of whether a person ought to be married or not ought to be married in a religious calling. What did Luther understand about authority in the family? Well, remember, this was 500 years ago. He was not a modern man. He was not a liberated thinker, as we would think of today. He did say, all persons are equal before God. God makes no distinction. All persons are equal before God. But there are distinct roles within the family. And just because one person has one role and another person has another role in the family, that doesn't mean the first person's better than the second or the second's better than the first. What were those roles? Husbands are called by God to rule and care for their wives. Now, care, we're okay with that, but when a lady today hears, my husband's supposed to rule me, whoa, that doesn't feel too good, right? Wives are called by God to obey their husbands. And likewise, parents are called by God to rule and care for their children. And children are called by God to obey their parents. Those are his rules for good domestic living. And you may remember back to what we said about the prince and his responsibility and his rights over the people and the people's need to obey the prince. So it was the same relationship between the prince and the people as between the husband, the father, and the rest of the family. He had some advice, and this advice, these little snippets come from his Table Talk. Table Talk is a book that was written not by Martin Luther, but by people that sat at his table and took notes on what he was saying. And there are, believe it or not, nearly 8,000 small quotations, proverbs. Think of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, something like that, right? Proverbs from Martin Luther that have been written down. We're not sure that they're all authentic because he didn't write any of them. He just said them and somebody else copied them down. But this is one of them. Advice for husbands. Make your wife sorry to have you leave the house. Not happy to leave the house, but sorry. Oh, I hate to see him go. Right? It's the husband's responsibility to make the wife feel that way. Okay? A wife advice. Make your husband glad to cross the threshold at night. Not, oh, there he is again, right? But, oh, I'm so glad to see you. And it's the wife's responsibility to make the husband feel that way. So there is a mutuality here in the relationship, despite the fact that he sees the husband and the father as the ruler of the house. That's just his role. He said to his wife, Kati, you have a husband who loves you. Let someone else be empress. In other words, being married to me is as good as being married to the emperor. You don't need anything more. I love you so much, and that ought to be enough to compensate for the fact that you're not the empress. He also said the union of the flesh between husband and wife does nothing. There must also be a union of manners and mind. You have to act the same way. You have to think the same way. That's what true union is between husband and wife. Well, finally, education. This is the fellow I mentioned earlier, Philip Melanchthon. He's the one that tells us for the first time in writing, 30 years after the event, that Martin Luther nailed those 95 theses on the castle church door in Wittenberg. He was younger than Luther and was a fellow professor with Luther in Wittenberg. Luther specialized in theology, and Melanchthon specialized in languages, in ancient Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin. They said his Latin was better than his German, even though German was his native language, but he was highly trained in all three of the classical languages. And he had some great ideas about changing the nature of education and changed what was taught in the schools, so much so that they called him Germany's teacher. They called him that, however, in Latin. Preceptor Germaniae is what it's called in Latin, Germany's teacher. And as you see there, he was a pretty thin guy. That's what education looked like in the Middle Ages. I'm going to try to explain this quickly. These are two pictures representing what are called the 7 liberal arts. We speak today of liberal arts and liberal arts colleges. Well, these are what the liberal arts looked like in the Middle Ages. They were divided into 2 groups, the trivium, which I have here on the left, and the quadrivium, which I have here on the right. The trivium is a collection of 3 subjects. Tri for 3. And the quadrivium is a collection of 4 subjects to be studied. Quad as in quarter, yeah? Well, the trivium is grammar. You have to know your grammar, and that was primarily Latin grammar. The next one was logic. You have to be able to think logically with the language you write. And finally, rhetoric. Rhetoric is the use of language to persuade. So these are the 3 subjects that were based in language. Over here we have the 4 subjects based in number or mathematics. Up at the top we have astronomy. And if some of those look like astrology symbols, that's because they are. At that time there was not much difference between astronomy, the study of the stars, and astrology, understanding how the stars might affect our lives, right? Over here is music. And remember, music was considered a mathematical science. It's mathematical for 2 reasons. One is it has rhythm, right? Yeah, you can understand that. But also the tones are mathematical. If you take a string that's this long and pluck it, bum, cut it in half, bum, 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 you get an octave. So it's mathematical. The tones are mathematical, as well as the rhythm. At the bottom, we have regular arithmetic. Look how these numbers are arranged. If you add 1 and 2, you get 3. If you add 2 and 4, you get 6. If you add 4 and 8, you get 12. If you add 3 and 6, you get 9, and so forth. So they did a lot of work with numbers and arrangements of numbers. And finally, the 4th science, mathematical science, was geometry. And these circles are representing geometry. So nothing really changes. When you boil this down, it comes down to the 3 R's, doesn't it? Reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Here's the reading and writing over on this side, and here's the arithmetic over on that side. But Philip Melanchthon said, I think we need to go a little farther. We need to go a little farther than this, and this is what he did. He said we should study things that we take for granted today, but weren't studied back then. We should also study history, how our people got to be the way they are. Geography, how people have moved from place to place. Poetry, the literature that people have written. And the new natural sciences, chemistry and physics. These were new things in the 1500s. And Melanchthon said, we should have our students at the university study these things. And of course, that's obvious today. Nobody would question whether you ought to study physics at a university. It's just done. So that's why he was called Germany's teacher. Now we're inside the castle church in Wittenberg, and we are looking here at the place where Philip Melanchthon and Martin Luther are buried. They are mentioned in Germany and in Wittenberg always side by side. My personal feeling is that without Philip Melanchthon, there may not have been a Reformation as a movement. Luther was not a very systematic thinker, not a very disciplined thinker. He thought kind of in tweets, we would say today, right? He thought in tweets, just ideas, this way. And it was Melanchthon who was able to take those tweets and tie them all together and make a logical system out of them. Also, he was able to translate Luther's works from German into Latin so that people outside Germany could read Luther's works. So he was really instrumental in spreading the Reformation. Now, you can't quite see it, but this is the pulpit in the church. Now, imagine today the pastor climbing up the stairs, preaching from that pulpit, and looking down at the grave of Martin Luther. That would be a little intimidating, I think, thinking, I got to preach as well as he did, right? That would be hard. Melanchthon on the other side. Here is Melanchthon's grave. You can see his name and written in Latin, his death date and birth date, and here is Martin Luther's grave plate on the other side. And standing here, looking at the altar of the church in Wittenberg, we are standing basically between the two graves. Melanchthon is buried over here, and Luther is buried over here. Now we're back outside at the church, the castle church in Wittenberg. And I put this slide in because I wanted to show you an architectural disaster, in my opinion. You see the top of that tower. That was redone in the 1890s. And it has that really heavy look of the Victorian architecture. Really heavy. I don't know how many of you remember the old Pittsburgh Zoo before they tore it down. Remember those massive buildings, just really weighty buildings. Well, that's fine in itself, but it doesn't belong on a small medieval chapel like this. And I'll show you what it used to look like, right? That's the original tower, much more slender, much more fitting the overall architectural design of the church. But then they had to go and do that and put this big blob on top of the tower. And around the base of it says, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress is our God. And I think they wanted to make it look like a fortress rather than a church. That's sort of what has happened there. Well, this is the marketplace in Wittenberg. On the left here you see Melanchthon and his statue, and here's Luther and his statue. And this is the city church in Wittenberg, which is actually much larger, not nearly as nice, but much larger than the castle church. And it was actually in this church that Martin Luther did most of his preaching. He really wasn't a pastor, as we understand that today in Wittenberg. He was a professor at the university, but he did do a lot of preaching there. And here you see them behind, this is the City Hall, and they are standing in front of the City Hall, Melanchthon here on the left and Luther on the right, and now they have little roofs over them, I suppose to protect them from the rain. There is Luther holding his Bible that he has translated, and at the base there is an inscription that says in German, Glaubet an das Evangelium, believe the gospel. And those are the first words of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus begins his ministry, those are the first words he says, believe the gospel, believe the good news. There's Melanchthon, and his quotation is from Psalm 119. And it says, roughly in English, if I can remember, I will give your testimonies before kings and princes. And the reason they chose that for Philip Melanchthon is that Philip Melanchthon was the author of the Augsburg Confession. The Augsburg Confession, which he took to the princes. He took that confession to the princes and had them support it. And that's how so many German states got to become Protestant rather than Catholic, that the princes accepted this confession. Now that Augsburg Confession was later taken into a larger group of documents called the Book of Concord, and that's why you're called Concordia. Okay? The Augsburg Confession is a part of the Book of Concord, and that's where the name Concordia comes from. So that brings us right up to our own day. That's where Philip Melanchthon lived. He got married too and had 4 children. He married the mayor's daughter, but it was hardly a scandal because he wasn't a priest. He was never ordained as a priest. He was a professor. And as you see, I'm married. It's okay for professors to get married. Nobody thinks that's a scandal. So that's the house of Philip Melanchthon in Wittenberg, as you see, much smaller than that large edifice that Luther lived in. And finally, the Luther Rose. The cross in the center, of course, with the heart around it. And the heart representing God's love for the people's love for God, and the people's love for one another. It goes 3 ways. God to the people to God, and the people with one another. So, I'm glad you're here. I was glad to be here with you. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them.